One of the things I often hear is people saying, I want to get on one of the bigger podcasts. And I remember having a conversation with somebody that couldn't understand why the podcast audience was the way they were. They said, why, just last week, I was on a radio show that got heard by 4 million people. And I asked her, what radio show was that? And she says, I don't know. I don't remember it. It was something out of Indianapolis. And I'm like, well, was it listened to by 4 million or did it have a reach of 4 million? There's a big difference, and we're going to get into that right now. What really makes a large podcast? But first, let's listen to a great podcast that also has a large audience.
Hey, this is Joe Saul-Sehy, host of both the Stacking Benjamins and Money with Friends podcast, and you're listening to Podcast Guest Profits, hosted by my friend Tom Schwab and sponsored by Interview Valet.
So Joe Saul-Sehy and the Stacking Benjamins podcast, it's been around for years. They've worked on it really, really hard, and they just got acquired or added to the Podcast One network, that same network that's owned by Westwood One. They have really gotten there. And if I was to estimate, I'd say Joe is probably in the top 2% on his way to being in the top 1% based on downloads. But what is a download? You see, that's a problem because one of the Achilles heels of podcasting right now is the analytics. People will say, well, how many people listen to it? How many people listen to a certain point? Now, by the terms of service with all of the hosting companies, they can't share that data on the individual basis. And I'm sure you can understand why. So the only people that really know the number of downloads is the host, podcast host, and the hosting company. And the hosting company can't share it. So now I don't want to say that people lie, but they can inflate things. I can say I can bench press 350. I'm not lying. You were thinking pounds. I was thinking grams. So let's go through and look at what the data says podcast downloads are. So this is from data. It's back in 2017. Libsyn is the largest company for hosting. And on their podcast called The Feed, Rob Walsh shared these numbers. Now, granted, these are back in 2017. The numbers have actually dropped since then. While the listenership has gone up, the number of podcasts have gone up also. So back in 2017, they said the top 1% of all podcasts that were hosted on Libsyn got 53 downloads per episode. If you drop down to 2%, it's about 28,000. The top 5% got 10,000. The top 10% get 4,000. The top 20% get 1,400 downloads. And the top half, so if you're an average podcast, you get 135 downloads. And this was typically within the first 30 days. And that's when most of the listenership happened in that first 30 days. So a lot of times people are struck by these numbers. And let me explain these a little bit. So people will say, well, it's only 1,400 people on that podcast. If it's top 20%, you're looking at about 1,400 listeners. Well, I would ask them, when was the last time you spoke to an audience of 1,400 people in the seats? You know, last year I went to an event. One of our clients spoke at Marlins Stadium, right? He was in front of 35,000 people on a physical stage. And I remember talking to him the night before, and he said, I was really, nervous. And I said, don't worry, you've spoken to more people than that on podcasts. And he said, yeah, but they weren't looking back at me. When I actually saw him speak, he gave a great speech, but all those 35,000 people, they weren't listening to him, right? Some of them were getting up. Some of them were going to the bathroom. Some of them were out on the phones. And that's one of the amazing things about podcasts is that every person that is there and listening is listening, right? There's no distraction. They have you in their ears. They can rewind it. They can listen again. They can share it. It's not like if I walk out to take a phone call, I can pause the podcast and come back to it. The studies also show that 70% of the people listen to the entire episode. That's something that engagement that you'll not get any other place. I remember an event that I went to with Brendon Burchard, and somebody up in the front asked, how do I get 1 million followers? And they asked this to Brendon Burchard, and I loved his answer. He looked back to him and he said, well, how many followers do you have right now? And the guy said, well, I've got about 150. And so Brendon goes, the first, whatever it was, 3 rows, please stand up. Everybody else stay seated. There was probably a few thousand people in the room. And he said, if you can focus on serving these people that you have right now, then you will get more and more people. And I think that same thing goes to podcast interviews too. This idea that I want to be on bigger shows. I want to be on Joe Rogan. I want to be on Oprah. Well, bigger is not better. Bigger is just bigger, right? What is a big dental podcast? I don't know the numbers, but I'm guessing the number one dental podcast is probably, I don't know, in the top 20% of all podcasts. I don't know. Maybe it's got 1,500, 2,000 downloads per episode. But if that is your audience, if that's who you want to talk to, you're going to get more people there than you will just talking to the masses. There's more fish in the ocean than there are in a barrel. But if you know what barrel you want to talk to, if they're there anxious for you, you'll have much more success there. So I hope that helps with download numbers. It's really interesting that it's a blessing and a curse, right? So the data isn't perfect. But with that, once the data gets perfect, it'll be just as competitive as the yellow pages. So with that, we've got the algorithm that we look at when we pick podcasts. We look at the podcast, the number of ratings and reviews they have. We look at the audience. Is it your ideal audience? Has it been around long enough that you know that it's not going to fade away? The podcast is just the first thing we look at. We also look at things like their website. What's the value of that social media link? Is that going to help you with the organic? We look at the reach. That's the third thing. The reach is how much are they promoting this on social media and to their email list? And then finally, we look at the experience with previous guests, right? Some podcasts have always converted well. Some podcasts have never converted well. I always say it's a little bit of art, a little bit of science, and a whole lot of experience.